Hello, and welcome to the Fiber Circus. This is episode 6, and it is Wednesday, October 10th, 2018. If you're a new viewer, thank you so much for joining me, and if you're a returning viewer, thanks a lot for coming back. If you need to get a hold of me, you can find me on Instagram as Spotted Circus, on Facebook as Spotted Circus Alpacas, and on Ravelry as Spotted Circus. You can also email me at spottedcircusalpacas@yahoo.com. All the information in this show will be down in the show notes, which are right down below. If you click on the little arrow, it'll actually open up into more of a description box, and that will show you everything that I've talked about with links this week. You can also please hit subscribe underneath on my YouTube channel because it gets me a few more viewers and a few more looks, and I'd really appreciate that. Thanks a lot. So this week, we have done a little bit of knitting by hand, and I did a lot of machine knitting because I had an event last week that I was vending at, so I needed to get a lot of finished goods done pretty quickly. So my first work in progress is my portage sweater. Not a surprise there. I've been working on it every episode so far, and it's still in my Bags by Awesome Granny bag with the cute little kids chasing after fireflies. My portage is being knit on the Spotted Circus Polwarth DK base in a colorway called the Neon Mermaid. I have, let's see, so the body's finished. So this is the body here. And there's this collar. I was working on this last time we talked, and it's a 6-inch wide collar that it goes down into this, which folds back when I get done. It'll fold back and actually form a pocket on the sweater here. So I did both the pockets, and I'm actually onto a sleeve right now. So as you can see, I've got a sleeve going on here, and all the little hangy-downy markers there are all my increases that I've done, or decreases actually, to make the sleeve a little bit more narrow. It is striping a lot more narrow in comparison to the body. The body I was actually alternating skeins on because I knew that since it was hand dyed, that they could be quite different. But I kind of stopped doing that on the sleeves. And now that I've got a good 6 inches on this sleeve, I'm not real keen on just ripping it back to try to make it match up here a little bit more, because at least both the sleeves will match in their stripiness. So I'm not going to alternate skeins. It may have made a difference, may not. You know, they don't really bother me. I mean, this isn't going to be a high fashion sweater, seeing as how vivid and bright it is. The back is all 1x1 cabling throughout the entire length. And I've tried it on and it does fit so far, which is always a good bonus. So when I'd last left off last week, I was right here. So I knit all of this in the pockets and then this sleeve. Ideally, I'd love for it to be done by SAFF, which is in 2 weeks. Probably not going to happen, simply because I'm doing a lot of dyeing right now, so my knitting time's kind of limited. It'd be nice if it was done. I may have to wear a half-sleeved sweater for a little while, or at least put it on display, so we'll see. The other thing that I worked on a little bit this week, since I was into doing quite a bit of seaming for my machine knitted stuff, I decided I was going to go ahead and piece together my faded cardigan that I was working on. And it's being kept in my high quality 2-gallon hefty Ziploc bag, which works wonderfully. So I went ahead and did the seams on my faded cardigan. And it's kind of hard to I mean, it's in one piece at least. So it's all Wollmeise and Rohrspatz yarns. The bottom color here it's a word different skein called Mondom 7 Haus, and then we go into Guide to the Galaxy, and then it goes into Gluckstag, and then the top color, the green and yellow, is called Mamba Samba. I can try it on here. I have sent it through the washing machine and the dryer already because it's completely superwash, so in theory it shouldn't be an issue. And I'll try to stand up here and show you a little. So it's not a full-length sleeve, which I didn't quite expect it was going to be because I was starting to run out of yarn, but the sleeves do match pretty well. And it's not quite as far in as what I thought it would be. It is supposed to be a V-neck, so I think the V comes down to right about here. And so then these parts should come across. I still have to pick up and do a button band, which is going to basically be a strip that's going to run the entire length up and out around the collar and then down. And I'm kind of stuck on how wide I'm going to make it, because I want for the cardigan to actually button, but I also don't want for it to be a shawl collar, per se. So I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do yet. But the purl side is out, and I like the purl side better than what I do the knit side. I just think it flows a little bit better through the cardigan. So I actually have woven in all the ends on it. So if I didn't mind the fact that it doesn't meet in the middle, it would be done. But you can see I've done a seam all the way up, and then I've seamed the arms all together, and then the top. The pattern was done using a program called Sweater Maker, where you put in what your gauge is, and then you adjust the measurements on the sweater. So the pattern is done using a computer program called Sweater Maker. And it's got a lot of sweater templates of different styles and sizes, and then you enter in what your gauge is based on your machine knitting, and it'll spit you out a pattern that's based on machine knitting as far as the way it's written. I think that the pattern was correct, but for it being a raglan style sweater, the front came up to being down to like 2 inches or 2 stitches wide where it joined here, and I don't think that's quite right. So that's why I'm kind of trying to decide still how wide of a collar I want to do on it, to see how I can change the way it's draping on me right now. But it does technically fit, which is always a bonus, because I've had that problem many times where I've made something and it's been close to fitting but not quite. So that's all my current works in progress that I'm actually actively working on. Casting on, I haven't cast on anything new because I've been pretty busy, so that's really a good thing. Finished objects, I have a lot, but I don't have any of them with me because they're all out for sale still in my trailer. So I was working on a bunch of machine knit cowls, hats, and infinity scarves for this winery event that I did last weekend. So I was trying to plug through things pretty rapidly, and on the last podcast I think I only had 3 hats done. Since then, so in the 2 weeks that I was knitting, so really it'd be more like a week and a half since I vended on Saturday, I managed to do 1 cowl, 6 infinity scarves, and 13 more hats, which is pretty good, I think. I'll insert pictures of all of them here. So they were almost all machine knit on my Brother 970, and they were pretty basic patterns for the most part. I did a few on a 260, which is a bulky machine, but I didn't quite like those as much, so I think really the finer weight and finer gauge machine is what it is I really prefer, but the bulky weight's actually nice to have for hand spun. So I only sold 1 hat out of the total of 16 that I made, which is a little bit disappointing, but it was also 86 or 87 degrees plus humidity, and a lot of people were drinking wine, so they were also warm, so it wasn't exactly the best of sales. I made my booth fee, which is the important thing, but it wasn't exactly the greatest of sales days. I had a lot of people walk by and see me spinning and say, "Oh look, she's weaving and making fabric." And I just had to shake my head and say no. And then I had to answer the question of, "Oh, alpacas, they spit and they're mean, they bite." And I'm sitting there thinking, I've never had an alpaca run at me and bite on purpose. So there's a lot of misinformation still out there. Not too surprising. Of course, some of those people could have been drunk. I saw a lot of adults carrying their own bottle of wine with a cup around, which I was kind of surprised about. I don't know that I've ever walked around an event carrying a full bottle of wine to myself, but entertaining. We did see the ambulance appear once for a guy who got overly heated and overly drunk, and he finally walked away, but always a little bit of excitement in Owen County. So, let's see, machine knitting. Besides all the hats and whatnot that I just completed, that's all I've really done machine-wise, because I'm, once again, prepping for SAFF. So while I was at the festival, I worked on some spinning, because it's always good to demonstrate something to start to keep people entertained and or draw them in. So I started spinning on one of my Patreon bats from Nicole Frost that were kind of in the rusty colors. And so this is the spinning that I've done so far. It's mainly merino and bamboo with some Angelina and Firestar in there. And then there's also some silk neps in there, like right there's a silk nep. So I've started spinning across, and now I'm getting into more of the neon orangey colors. I'm thinking I'm going to spin all 3 bats together and then maybe chain ply it to maintain the colorways to make some long gradients. But I'm not 100% sure, because when I got there and I picked up the bat that was labeled as number 1, I realized looking at the pictures it wasn't necessarily the one that I would have started with. So I got to kind of make some decisions, but I may just spin each bat individually and then wind them off as balls and then ply them that way. So, spun really well. This is on my 16-ounce Firefly bobbin, so you can see I've probably got 2.5 to 3 ounces on there right now. But it's a nice big bobbin. I mean, my head can fit inside of the bobbin, so this isn't the biggest one. I have a 32-ounce bobbin, and they also make a 64-ounce bobbin, so tiny bobbin technically, but lots of space still. So, besides that, that's the only spinning I've really been working on. I've had some acquisitions over the last 2 weeks, and some of these were pre-orders. So I haven't gone all like wool crazy and stuff. It's just things have been pre-ordered several weeks ago and have just now started to come in. So my first acquisition is from Desert Vista Dyeworks. They're known for mainly doing self-striping colorways. And I'll just leave this in the plastic, but it's called Proud as a Peacock. And it's obviously a peacock colored striping that they do. And it's a self-striping sock yarn. This would actually make a really pretty hat, I think, or possibly an infinity cowl like I was making earlier. So, very pretty. Adding to my self-striping collection. And then there was a new to me dyer that posted an update, and I'd been watching her stuff, but I hadn't been able to actually get my hands on any of it. And her name is Hutch, and she's from the UK, I know, but I have a feeling that it's actually Ireland or Scotland. But I don't want to offend her if I'm wrong. So, her name is Hutch. She's really cool. She's got teal hair right now, but she's with Dye Candy. And this is her colorway called Dark Magic. And it's just kind of a fun, deep, dark colorway with little pops of color in it. It's a Superwash Merino nylon. And when I got it, I went to go put it in my stash, and I found out, boy, I have very similar taste, because look at this. This is a hedgehog fiber sock yarn. And boy, they're awfully similar. There's some orange in the Dye Candy that there isn't in the hedgehog. But that's kind of entertaining when I'm looking at the two of them together. They're pretty similar. So they go really well together. Maybe in like a shawl or a fade or something. But yeah, you can tell if you aren't actually in your stash all the time, stuff can actually add up somewhat easily and you realize, oops. She also had some Rolags for sale that were based on her logo. And the Rolags are actually made by Sybo Hanscroft, who is, it doesn't really say where she's from, but I know that she's from over in Europe, someplace. And it doesn't actually say what the content of these Rolags is. But I have a feeling it's mainly Merino and Angelina is what it's looking like. I've never actually spun a Rolag before. Simply because I don't do long jaw spinning very well. But I thought this was a great way to try it. I think there's 2 ounces roughly in there. So, and they were nice bright colors, so I think that they'll be a lot of fun to eventually spin. And then the last thing happened because I was looking on Etsy, or not on Etsy, on Instagram, and people were posting about yarn advent calendars. And I'd heard about the Opal advent calendar, which is a whole bunch of little tiny sock yarn minis that are, I think, 10 or 20 grams. And they weren't going to do it this year. So it got me just going, what else is out there? And then I came across a post by, I think it's Amba O'Brien. And she had what was called the Adventurous wrap that she's done, I think, at least 2 years in a row. And it's a big conglomeration of mini skeins where they all fade together, but then it makes this giant shawl for you. And there were people with pre-orders to their advent calendars. So I started stumbling across those, and then I found one that the colors just really spoke to me. And I'll try to put a picture of what it is I saw up here. And I just thought, wow, that's gorgeous. So I went to their website, and it was, of course, sold out. And I was like, well, nuts. So I started following the dyer on Instagram, and last week, I think it was, she posted that she was going to dye a few more of those, and then there'd be some for pre-orders. And I'll admit, the price wasn't very small. This is over 2,000 yards of fingering weight, but this is going to basically be my Christmas present to myself, and that's it, probably, because when I saw the stuff, I fell in love. So, it came from Stitched Together Studio, who's based out of Iowa, and it was a pretty new-to-me dyer. I hadn't really ever heard of her before. But this is her Rainbow Chain Mini Skein set, and it's 25 skeins of Superwash Merino and nylon for 2,300 yards. And the color, the chain color, is called Shrimp on the Barbie. So it starts right here with some pretty speckles and some reds and some pinks, and then it goes into some neons and some greens and some blues and some purples. And it's huge. It weighs a ton. But you can see that when you put all these together, just how pretty it's going to be. So this was my one splurge kind of for the year here. But I think that this is going to make a gorgeous big shawl. I'm going to probably put them in a slightly different order. Looking at the picture that she had online of the shawl that she created, it faded really, really well from like the yellows into the other colors. So like this white one is probably going to get relocated in between, so that way it fades a little bit better. But she had actually listed all the individual skeins as far as colors and whatnot on there. So it's really neat. You know, people are looking at this going, what in the world is that? And it's basically mini skeins turned in half and then looped through each other to make this giant chain of yarn. So this right now is my precious. It's just going to kind of sit aside for a while. I may join in the actual knit-along that's going to happen based on the Adventurous cowl. I think it starts December 1st, if I remember right, because it's an advent calendar, so in theory you should be opening them up then. So, I got that. It was a splurge, but, you know, it's not something that I would probably necessarily dye, because I haven't really done mini skeins much, because they're a lot of work for a little tiny thing. So, we'll see. Travels. Last Saturday, I vended at the Owen Valley Winery Harvest Festival. Like I said, it was really hot out and it was kind of slow. But it's interesting because I met two of my neighbors that I've never met, and we've been living here since 2004. So I met a nice young couple that lived down around the corner from us who knew us based on the alpacas. And then I met one of the sheriffs in town whose brother is building a rental on the lot right next to us, and he knew that we had alpacas and thought we were running generators all the time, which are actually the fans to keep the alpacas cool. But the neighbor next door to us, where there's an empty lot, has dragged a trailer onto there, and the trailer doesn't have a door and doesn't have some of the roof intact. And he's telling me that he's going to be very particular about his rental people. I'm a little bit worried. I'm hoping and praying it's a nice old lady that likes to craft and could maybe farm sit every now and then. But, you know, it's a little scary right now, so we'll see what happens with that. Coming attractions. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be out in Asheville, North Carolina for SAFF. So my next podcast will be when I'm actually traveling out to SAFF. So it may be an abbreviated podcast and or a walkthrough of the actual booth and some of the stuff I've got on display, or some pictures from SAFF. Because I don't know, I've got an Airbnb there, so I might be able to do some recording at the Airbnb, but expect probably a lot of product photos and walkthroughs. So that's next, let's see, October 26th through the 28th. So we'll move into the education segment here, but I want to talk a little bit about selecting alpaca fleeces that you can actually process at home. Based on some of the posts I've seen on Facebook, there's a lot of alpaca out there that really shouldn't be processed at home because it's not going to get you a superior product. So I wanted to walk through and show people what to look for when you're selecting a fleece, what an average fleece looks like versus a superior fleece, and some of the traits that you probably don't necessarily see in the alpaca fleeces that you're getting if you're getting them for free or for a pretty low cost. Unfortunately, a lot of alpaca owners know how to breed alpacas, but they don't necessarily understand fleece qualities and how it is that they reflect into spinning and whatnot. So, okay, so here we're going to talk a little bit about fleeces. And I wanted to start out with what I'd consider to be the typical alpaca fleece that I see for sale online these days. If you look at the fleece, it's nothing really that fancy. You can't really see a ton of crimp in it. It's kind of dull in color. You see these long pointy tips on it, which is usually indicative of some guard hair presence, which is going to cause prickliness to it. If I actually touch it pretty hard, you can see the amount of dust that comes out of it. Very typical for alpaca. And something you may see in some of your alpaca is this, and it's basically a skin condition issue where the animals had dry skin throughout the year. It can be flicked out, but it's a lot of work to get it to come out, so it's something just to keep in mind. This is a pretty typical alpaca fleece, I'd say, though. This animal's over 10 years old. The staple length's not bad still for this animal, about 3 inches still, but there's all of this in its tips, which is a primary, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today. So, while not a bad fleece, it's not necessarily something that you'd want to process at home. But unfortunately, that's what I see a lot of in the industry. It is soft feeling, but it's not what you could be dealing with. So, I don't have any other real specific fleeces to work on here, so I have some pieces of fleeces. So, this is a section of fleece that I got from one of the sorts that I was working on, and I wanted to bring it in order to show you some different things about it. If we pretend this was an entire fleece, you can see there's obvious areas here where there's different things. For example, there's this. This is basically leg, belly, chest hair. You can see just how thick those fibers are up in the top. This is straight guard hair. This, if it's in your fleece, throw it out. It's not worth doing anything with unless you're felting for like dryer balls or felt sheets where you don't mind the prickle factor in it. But this is basically junk. Get rid of it. When you start looking a little bit further at this fleece, you can see there's some areas that are lighter than what the main part of the fleece is. Almost always on this color, this is considered to be a fawn fleece, they're almost always at least 3 to 4 microns higher than what the main body of the fleece is. When you look at it in whole, it's actually really kind of pretty. It's got nice crimping to it. It has a nice squish when you feel it and a soft handle. If you then flip the fleece over, you can see this is most likely a cria fleece. So this is probably a baby's very first shearing. It has all these little bitty like tails coming off the edge that are a different color. They're sunburnt tips is what they are. As the baby's born, the amniotic fluid will actually sunburn the tips and it'll cause debris to stick to it. The debris level in this really isn't too horrible per se. I mean, there's some debris there, but it's not the worst that I've seen. Pulling out a lock, pulling on those tips, they're not coming off, which normally will happen on a weak cria tip fleece like this. So if I was skirting this, I would probably get rid of some of this because it's a little bit lighter colored. This is a fleece where for hand processing it is going to take a little bit more effort to get some of this debris out, so combing it is a good idea. There's an alpaca piece of poop because, you know, it's in there sometimes. Looking at this right now, I'd be pulling this off because it's different. So you're trying to make things as similar as possible. So, looking at this, if I was to be buying this fleece, what I'd want to do is look on it in both black and white paper. So let me see if I can zoom in a bit here. Okay, so why look at it in black and white paper? Even in a white fleece, there can be colored fibers in it, so it's good to look at it on both black and white. And for some colors of fiber, it's going to make it easier to look at. So what I do is I put a little bit of pressure on it and I pull some out. And what I'm looking for is, are all the fibers in this fleece the same thickness? So here's a second sample, and then we'll pull out a piece of this stuff just to kind of show you a bit of a difference here. So, looking at this, this is definitely probably a sub 20 micron fleece. And I'm gonna pull the camera here. There's a lot of dirt, which that isn't surprising. So what I want you to see is, if you see these thicker fleeces, these pieces, this piece right here, there's that one right there. Can you see how much thicker those are than the rest of the fibers? Those are hairs that stand out pretty obviously. They're most likely primary fibers. They're not necessarily guard hairs, but even still, when you look at this fleece in general, you have this thickness up here, which is very, very fine to the point where it almost disappears. This is getting stronger. You can see the fibers more easily. And down here in this section, I mean, they jump right out. They're like human hair looking almost. So this is showing a lack of consistency. And how's that going to affect what it is that you're doing? So a lack of consistency will create issues when you're drafting, because the microns won't want to slide quite as easily past each other. And so your drafting won't be near as consistent, and your finished yarn won't be as consistent. So this is where you want to go through and skirt your fleeces. These two sections here are slightly different colored, and as you can see, one of them slightly higher in micron than what the other one is. And then this really light piece is obviously very high. That piece that I pulled out, that I said was probably leg, chest, and belly, I mean, look at that in comparison to that. If you leave this in with this finer stuff, you're going to have a lot more problems in a yarn. So these right here are almost strictly guard hairs, most likely. They have little to no crimp in them, compared to these primaries up in here, which may have blown away now. There we go. There's some primaries up there. So those primaries actually have some crimp to them. You can see that they're actually bending slightly. These don't bend. If I were to bend them and then release them, they actually snap back into place. And it's mainly because they're most likely hollow on the inside. While the guard hairs are important for an alpaca fleece, what they'll cause is a prickly sensation in your yarn. Because these ends don't bend and stay in together with the rest of the yarn, they'll actually poke out of your yarn at all times and then poke against your skin, which is going to cause a prickle factor. It's also why if you're using alpaca that has not been dehaired or not sorted very well, that you could get a yarn that sheds, or you could get a yarn where people claim that they're allergic to alpaca as a result. Not all primaries are guard hairs, but all guard hairs are primary fibers. Their main job is to protect the soft, well, this isn't really that soft, but a softer downy undercoat. So they're present. They're even present in Merino sheep. However, the Merino sheep breed has had years to work on making the primary fibers and the secondary softer fibers to the same micron or lower. Alpacas aren't there yet. They're attempting to get there, but it's going to take time, unfortunately. So if this were an entire fleece, what I would most likely do is I would skirt out some of this junk. So I'd be looking at this as a whole, and I'd be pulling off this stuff that's a little bit lighter. You can see the crimp changes from there to here. There's a pretty big difference. So when in doubt, pull it out. That's what the nuns that taught me all about fiber showed us. They said, when in doubt, pull it out. You know, the animal's going to grow new fiber next year. Even still here, we have some crimp, but the crimp doesn't go all the way to the tip. So put it aside. It's not saying that you need to necessarily throw this away, but it's definitely not what it is you want in your finished yarn. So this, if this was an entire fleece, I would say you most likely have to comb this with hand combs because of the debris level. Your other option would be to pull out the locks individually and flick them with like a dog flicker brush or actual flicker combs just to get some of that debris out. If you attempt to card it as is, most likely that debris will just become more embedded in the fleece, or what will happen is that debris will be sticking in the tips, and they will actually pull off during carding, and you'll end up with neps in your yarn. So okay, so this is another fleece that I've pulled out to look at. Once again, really crimpy, gorgeous chocolate brown color to it. It has amazing squish and handle as to where it is. You can really kind of imagine making this into a sweater. However, when you flip it over to its tip side, you see this. This, unfortunately, is not really processable. If you send it to a mini mill where they have a dehairer can remove some of this vegetative matter, but it's not going to remove it all. And as a result, you're going to end up with little bits of hay and chaff within your finished yarn product. This was a Crea fleece, so this was its baby fleece, and these were the amniotic tips. And so that's why all this debris stuck to this fleece. It's also slightly tender. Now, you don't want to be He-Man when you're pulling at the tips, but you just want roughly about a pencil's width, and you just want to pull. And if you feel it start to stretch and break like that, it's tender. So, what do you do if you get a fleece like this? First things first, hopefully you didn't buy this fleece and pay a lot of money for it. If you did, the only way that I think you could really salvage this into some kind of yarn is going to be a true labor of love. You're going to have to comb this fleece by hand in order to remove all of this dirt. And the reality of it is, it's probably not worth your time unless this is a really special animal that was a part of your farm that you really cared about, and this is the only fleece that you had. This level of debris, it's good for mulch at this point, and that's about it, which is really kind of sad because underneath the fiber is exquisite. I mean, it's very, very lustrous, it's very squishy, it's a beautiful color to it. We'll pull out a piece and look at it on our black and white paper. So looking at it on our paper, you can see super fine crimp to it, to the point where it reminds me almost of a Merino or a Cormo style fleece. Stretching out some of it. So, let me zoom a little bit closer, and the wind is not working with me here today. So, do you see these huge, huge hairs here? So this is a problem, because the secondary fibers over here are extremely fine. When you get to separating them out into individual fibers, this fleece is probably down in the 16 to 17 micron range. However, look at these. There's a lot of these guard hairs. When you're looking at a fleece, and I'm looking at just a straight staple of a fleece, I don't want to see any more than 3 of these per staple, because if so, it's going to start to affect your finished yarn. If this fleece didn't have such a debris problem, sending it to a mini mill, because there's such a micron difference between these secondaries and these super strong primaries, a dehairer or fiber separator would actually be able to remove all these, or at least a good portion of them. So how a fiber separator works is there's multiple drums that as they're turning, they turn at different speeds, and the speed helps to basically centrifugally throw these stronger, heavier fibers out, leaving your finer fibers behind. This is a fleece where, looking at the amount of hair in this sample, this for me would most likely be a pet automatically and not a breeder, simply because if it has this much hair going on as a juvenile animal under a year, it's probably not going to improve. It's probably only going to get more hairy as time goes. And it's really kind of sad because it's got gorgeous crimp to it. And it actually has some pretty nice luster when you look at the reflectivity of it. So this fleece, unfortunately, would be trash for me, simply because I don't have time to try to comb all this debris out. And trying to comb out all that debris is going to take you years. Is it worth it? Not for me. This actually came into a commercial sort, and at a commercial sort, this level of debris is unacceptable, and this fleece would have been trashed. The owner would have paid to ship this fleece to the sort, and then the fleece would have been thrown out, because it's not usable. So, some people have come up with the idea of taking the fleece and attempting to cut all these tips off where all the debris is. The problem with that is you now have 2 cut ends, and each end has a blunt tip. So when you attempt to spin it in, that blunt tip isn't going to bend as well into your yarn production, and it's most likely going to cause more problems than what you're going to be able to salvage. So unless this is a prized animal this is the only fleece that you have of it, when in doubt, throw it out. Makes great mulch. The birds will like it for bird nesting material as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at the other type of alpaca, which is called the Surrey. This is a Surrey baby fleece, so it's a cria fleece. Surreys are known for having very locky fleeces that form very distinct individual locks. They're also known for their luster. And if you can look here, you can really see the shine that happens on that. Surrey blends really, really well with silk as a result. It's really great for strong weaving yarns, and typically you go for a finer yarn with Surrey because of the fact that if you try to squeeze this fleece into a bulky weight yarn, you're going to have to put a lot more of these fibers to create that bulky yarn, and it's going to become very heavy. So there's a couple different lock types in Surrey, and I don't know that this fleece necessarily has them all, but depending upon the lock style, it's really going to show you how much easier it's going to be to work with or not. The majority of this fleece is called a flat lock with a wave and then a twist. So in the days past, it used to be very, very popular for these Surrey locks to be very, very tightly wound to the point where they called them pencil locks. And they were so tightly twisted from the cut end to the tip end that they were very, very hard to get to open for processing. Nowadays, with this flat lock up at the top and a wave and a twist, this can easily open up for processing. The biggest difficulty that I've seen with processing Surrey is getting the locks to open up enough, so that way when you card it, you're not ripping into the Surrey. So this is a nice example of that, how it's flat up at the top and then it locks downward, and you can see there is some twist within that lock. So this is about a 5.5 to 6 inch long lock. That's pretty typical for younger Surreys. I've seen them where they go over 2 feet, at which point it's most likely not been shorn for 2 years. Depending upon the climate where you're at, that can work. Otherwise, what you see is a break, usually about halfway through from heat stress. So when looking at Surrey, Surrey likes to stick together. So it's a little bit harder to look at individual micron fibers in Surrey as a result, and you have to actually put forth a little bit more effort into it. So kind of fan apart the end so that way it'll spread out well. Most Surreys actually have a very waxy or greasy sensation to them. So you do have to wash them in slightly hotter water than what you would a wakaya. So most Surrey is not in the sub 20 micron range like some wakayas are. Most Surrey is closer in the 22 to 24 range, I'd say. But it's usually extremely consistent. So when you're looking at those fibers there, you can see they're thicker than the last couple samples we've looked at. However, if you look at them, they're consistently thick. They're all the same thickness. There's maybe 1 or 2 here that are slightly thicker, but if you actually take a pencil eraser and start to separate them out a little bit more, they will separate into finer individual fibers. So when you're looking at Surrey, you're looking at consistency. You know, how consistent is it across there? You're also looking at the tips for hair. This fleece doesn't really have any hair to it, but I have seen hairy Surrey. It's slightly harder to identify because of the fact that the fleece is naturally slightly thicker and straight. Usually where you see it at is in the tips. So these tips are pretty solid. There isn't a whole bunch of little fuzzy things coming off of them. So most likely this fleece is not hairy. This fleece, however, is slightly tender. So when you pull on the tips, I'm getting a break about 1 inch in. And this little Surrey had actually a pretty rough start in life, and that's why it is that this is having those issues. So what do you do if you have a fleece like this? It's actually extremely clean, which is nice. We really appreciate that. What I'm going to do with a fleece like this, because I know it's tender, is I'm going to core spin it. I'm just going to probably wash it, fluff it up into a cloud, and then core spin it. And when you core spin, it's the same as if you were making rug yarn. You have a core, which is my finger here, and the fleece actually wraps out around it as you're making the yarn. And what that does is it tucks in any broken out ends, it tucks in any pokey bits and whatnot, and it makes for a really nice, smooth yarn. It's a great use for broken or tender fleeces because of the simple fact that you still can make them usable. You could go through and hand comb this to actually pop most of those tips off. However, if you ran it through a drum carder as is, those little tips would break off in the processing and you'd end up with a bat that's full of neps and noils, which if you're going for a nice smooth art or a nice smooth Surrey yarn, you aren't going to get it that way. So, but in comparison, this is a little piece of merino, actually. And merino fleeces, when you look at them as individual fibers, merinos have had hundreds of years to work on improving their fleece quality. When you look at the individual fleece or individual fibers in this merino, you aren't going to see any that are really substantially thicker than what its friends are. And that's why merino's so popular. It's consistent, it's been like this for years, and it's had years to work on the development. So when you're looking at fleeces, usually the number one color that everyone wants is a gray fleece. And this is a gray fleece. It's a really unusual gray fleece in that it's a taupey gray. It's a color that I call mushroom, and it's one of my females that I own here. Gray fleeces are unusual in that they're usually made up of black and white fibers or black, white, and brown fibers in the case of rose grays. This fleece has not been skirted. Looking at this fleece, right off the bat I can look at this and say, that's junk, that's an armpit, that needs to be pulled out. This right here, that's an armpit, that needs to go. I haven't skirted this fleece at all. But when you get down into the good bits of the fleece, first off, she's nice and clean, which is always a bonus. And let me pull several locks here from different spots. So when you're looking at a fleece, you want to pull from 3 or 4 spots at least if you can. Because what you're wanting to get an idea of is the consistency of that fiber. You know, is the blanket all 1 micron level roughly? Or is it 5 or 6 different types of micron in there? And depending upon how inconsistent it is, you may want to do something different with that fleece, with different parts of it. So, let me zoom in here. So, because this is a gray, we're definitely going to want to look at it on a couple of different colors. So, looking at this piece, let me pull this out so I can look closer. Oh no, it's running away. Alright. So, let me try to do this one-handed here. So, looking at it on black and white, over here in the white, or on the black piece of paper, you can see extremely fine fibers. There's not a lot of difference between them. Looking at it over here on the dark or on the white side, you can see there's a couple of stronger fibers. Back there, there's one, and there's another one up in here, but not too bad for the most part. Now looking at this piece, this was more of an edge. You can see these strong fibers down here. There's a couple over here. And they're quite a bit stronger than what, let's say, the white is over here. But we also have a micron difference from that piece to this piece down here. And this is the problem with grays. With grays, because they're made up of multiple colors of fibers, you're going to have a difference in microns. That right there is definitely a true guard hair. This big, fat, pokey one. That's not, you can see it's not bent in like this one over here is. This one's probably a primary, but not necessarily a guard hair, whereas this big, fat one right here is definitely a guard hair. When I poke at it, it bounces right back to where it was. There's no bending in of it. Whereas the other little guy that's trying to run away, you can actually move it around and it'll stay bent. So this one will spin into your yarn and not cause a prickle factor, whereas this other big fat guy that's right there is going to cause a prickle factor for you. You can see when I bend it, it springs right back to where it was. So that's what's going to cause the itch factor in your yarn. Running it through a dehairer would definitely remove this. But this fleece as a whole isn't necessarily so hairy that it would have to be dehaired. There's one more right down in there as well, and there's one up in here. And I think this was actually pulled more from a side. But you can see the difference. So there's different shades of this color here. This is a much darker gray than what this piece is up in here. And you can see that there's a lot more hair in the darker piece than what there is in the lighter piece. And that's a traditional problem with grays. There's a lot of grays that when you look at a histogram on them, which is it's a test that basically measures the diameter of all the individual fibers in a sample. And you can get a test that is sub 20 micron, which this probably will test out as, but then it has a high SD, which is a standard deviation. So when you're looking at the histogram, there's a triangle on it, and it shows the percentage of each micron of fiber within it. This triangle would be more wide open at the base because of the fact that there's all these stronger fibers within it, versus a fleece that doesn't have those, whereas the triangle would be very tall and pointy. So that's something, if you're looking at buying based strictly on histograms, you want to look at that for sure. These are definitely over 30 micron too, these really strong fibers, so you want to look at the percent over 30. Much more than, 2 or 3% over 30, and I would be looking to dehair a fleece like this. This is a really unusually colored fleece though. And when you look at it in general, you can see it's almost a taupey color. Very unusual. Her name's Blackout. We also call her Measles at times. She's one of those that doesn't really fit a color definition, which is kind of why I like her. But she has little bitty spots all over her. But she's pretty unusual. So let me get one more fleece here. Okay, so this is the last fleece that we're going to look at today. And we're going to look at it for a pretty specific reason. If you notice, let me try to look at the whole fleece here. It's laid out as if it came off the body. And then they actually rolled it up in plastic. And that's what's called noodling. When you noodle a fleece, it's really easy to see where the armpits are and where to pull like nasty edges from. Like for example, right here, you can see there's these straight sections. That's most likely an armpit or a lower hip. So it makes it a lot easier to remove. But why I really wanted to show you this fleece was, if you look at the crimp on this animal, it's just exquisite to look at. It's super, super crimpy. It breaks apart into little teeny tiny locks. But the other reason why is I want you to see the luster on this fleece. This is a very healthy animal, and it shows it in its fleece. But if you look at it underneath the light, it's literally glowing with the amount of reflectivity within that fleece, to the point where it's almost like silk. This is a hard trait to really get. It's in some of the top fleeces that you'll see in the US. Definitely not your common alpaca fleece that you would see though. I mean, if you just look at it, you can see the light reflecting off of it left and right. And when you feel a fleece like this, it literally feels slightly greasy, like a sheep fleece. But the glow on that, on a judging scale for alpacas, they scale up to a 10 on luster or brightness is what it's called. This would score a 9, which this is one of the brightest fleeces I think I've ever seen. In getting brightness like this, it's usually a sign of extreme consistency within a fleece. And how you can tell that is, with this brightness comes organization. You can see that these individual bundles, they all form together really well. All of the bundles, all the fibers align within a bundle. And because they're all aligned and going in the same direction, they're the same micron, it causes a greater reflectivity within that fleece. So it's going to be an extremely consistent fleece. The downer about this fleece is, with super fine fleeces comes super tons of debris sometimes. It's also slightly tender. So when I pull out a lock here, we'll pull out an individual lock. And we'll pull on it. And the ends are slightly tippy. So, but when we look at this on our black and white paper, you're going to see the extreme consistency in this fleece. Alright, so looking at these individual fibers, it's kind of hard to tell because they're so fine that they don't separate out well. Each of these little bundles, which looks big, is actually multiple fibers within that bundle. So now this is an extreme close-up, so, I mean, look in comparison to the size of my fingernail there. These are very, very fine fibers, and if you look at them, they're almost all the exact same width. Beautiful fleece. This animal, for those of you that may be in the market for an animal, is actually currently a fiber fleece animal. When you see fleeces like this that are so advanced and so dense, there's a lot of fleece on this animal. It's actually a very, very small animal in real life. And part of that could be because it's putting all of its energy into producing this fleece, because this fleece is superior versus attempting to grow. So this fleece, this animal at this shearing would have been a yearling. And her name is Billy's Korea, and she comes from Mountain Sky Ranch out in Colorado with Deb Dorband. Deb allowed me to have this fleece because it's just exquisite to be able to show the true luster that you can find in alpaca fleeces that are way at the top echelon, in my opinion, of quality. So if anybody's interested in this animal, whether as a fiber pet, let me know, and I'll put you in contact with Deb. This little animal, for the size that it is, I think she said it's roughly a 45-pound animal. It's producing a lot of fleece for such a little bitty thing. And this fleece is just gorgeous. This is something where, when I get time, I'm going to actually process this. It's going to take a little bit more effort because of the fact there is some debris. I mean, right here's a seed head that's exploded. And that kind of sucks. Once those little seed heads explode, it's hard to get it out. But even if I sit here and shake it, I can get some debris to drop out, but probably not all of it. What I'm going to do with it long term is probably core spin it would be my guess, but it's going to take a bit to get to that phase. So right now for me it's a display to kind of show people, wow, you know, especially if you've never seen a top fleece and you didn't know that those existed, this is a great example of what alpaca fleece can be at the top levels. So hopefully this has helped you guys a little bit with selecting alpaca fleeces. You definitely want to look at your fleece. Don't buy sight unseen unless it's extremely cheap, because you may be buying mulch. Keep an eye out for debris on your alpacas. Keep an eye out for tenderness. And then definitely look at it on both black and white paper to look for those primaries and see, is this a hairy fleece? Which, if it's a hairy fleece, send it to a mill with a dehairer and you'll still have an exquisite product. But that isn't necessarily something that I would go and process myself, because those guard hairs are still going to be in there and they're still going to be pokey for you. And besides that, let me think if there's any other tips that I can give you. I think those are the major tips that I can give you. You know, I always have fleeces for sale if you're looking for fleeces, especially in specific colors, or I know of people who would have those fleeces. Definitely, I personally wash all my alpaca before I process it if possible, because of all the dirt that these guys roll in. All that dirt's going to then come up into your nostrils, and it's just not going to make for a pleasant spinning experience. And it's also going to, as you're drafting, somewhat abrade against the fiber, which is going to cause a rougher hand on your spinning and may cause more inconsistency in it. If you're buying fleeces from down in like the Georgia area where they have the red Georgia clay, and you get an alpaca that looks orange like a Cheeto, that dirt actually does abrade against the fiber, and it creates a much rougher hand in your finished yarn. And it will never fully wash white either. So, while natural dyeing is great and all, if you're trying to get a white fleece and you buy one that's orange, it's going to end up looking like a peach alpaca in the long run. So, just keep that in mind. So, if you have any questions about fleeces, let me know. Shoot me an email. I will be at SAFF in 2 weeks, and I will have some really nice fleeces for sale there if you decide you want to start hand processing some yourself. So, hope that helped you out. So I've also got a shop update this week. Well, it's not really a shop update. It's more of a here's what I've been dyeing kind of a thing, because at this point I don't want to stick anything new into the shop, because trying to keep track of where it is and what's going on and what I've got versus when I'm leaving for SAFF, it doesn't go real well. So I've been dyeing up a ton of yarn. Next week will most likely all be roving and comb top dyeing. I have a bunch of grade 1, so sub 20 micron white alpaca that's been blended with Starbright, which is a lofty sparkly fiber that's coming back. So I'm going to have 10 pounds of that to get dyed up. So hopefully that gets done quickly, and I keep the mojo flowing right now. So I've decided that I'm going to start offering some tonals in my yarns, because I want to be able to sell sweater quantities to people, and I know that not everyone's going to want the crazy brightness that my sweater is, so I'm working on a few new tonals. So this is what I'm calling the color of money. It's kind of a jade green with hints of a blue tone and possibly a few blue speckles within it. This is on my Polwarth DK base. I've also dyed it up on my alpaca merino bamboo nylon fingering weight as well. And depending on what other yarns I get in, I may dye it on that. I also do have a sweaters quantity in the as yet to be named Aran weight that I did the hat out of a few weeks ago. That's the silk tube with the alpaca and merino blown in. So it's really kind of a pretty deep color, which I like. So also on my Polwarth DK is this color. I'm calling it Barn Red. It's kind of a rusty red, tonal red that to me really reminds me of barn paint from the good old farm barns. So I've got this on Polwarth, and also I have to dye it still on Pacaboo. And then I also have this purpley tonal with some slight hints of a redder tone to it. And I think I'm going to call this the Grape Ape. And this is it on Polwarth, but I also have it dyed already on Pacaboo. And you can see the difference that the 20% bamboo makes. It really lightens it up quite a bit in comparison to the straight wool. So I've got those done. And then I also dyed up some of the Neon Mermaid in case people like my half-finished sweater. And that's on Polwarth DK. And then I also have a limited number of skeins of this right now. I'm hoping to get a few more in next week. The yak, let me think, it was merino, alpaca, yak, mulberry silk. And so this is, I think it's a sport weight if I remember right. And I think I'm going to call it either spring leaf or new growth. It's a really pretty chartreusey, but with a brown undertone to it. But I really like how it came out. And I only have 3 skeins right now, but I'm hoping I can get a few more of them dyed. And then I'm also working on my self-striping sock yarn, which is a lot of work. If you have never dyed self-striping sock yarn, you tend to wind it off yard by yard, so it's a lot of effort. I found a 50-yard warping mill that's going to be out at SAFF for sale that I've bought. That'll hopefully speed up my production quite a bit. So the only issue is it's like a 4 to 5 foot wide thing. So it's going to be something where I'm going to have to take it up and put it back down every time I want to use it. But so far I've dyed up this. So this is called Black Unicorn Mane, and this is on Superwash Merino nylon, and I'll also have it on my Pacaboo base. So it runs with 10 rounds of black and then 10 yards of a neon rainbow. So as you're knitting it, the rainbow tends to stripe either vertically or it tends to wrap out around in a horizontal manner. So I'll have a few skeins of this at the store at SAFF. We'll see how much more self-striping I get done. It's just a lot of effort for what it is that I'm selling sometimes, so we'll see. So that's the majority of what I've been dyeing recently. Everything after SAFF will go into our online store. It'll just take me a week or two at least to get everything up because it takes a while to get good photos and then get them all listed. So that's about it for that. As far as the sideshow goes, let me think. Everything's been pretty normal. Our girl, Daliance, who's the mother of our little Kriya, was getting a lot of shots. And I think I talked about it on the last podcast where she started to have some seizures and we had to do a lot of medicating with her. So she was getting something like 6 shots a day. And she finally got to the point where she hates us enough that she doesn't want to come up to get the shots, which is a good sign. We found out that she was a little bit low in magnesium and phosphorus. Probably not to the point where it would cause the seizures. So we're not 100% sure what's happened with her, but it's stopped, which is a good thing. But as a result, we're still bottle feeding the Kriya. So she's up to 22 pounds, which is pretty good, given that she started at 9. She's taking a bottle to a bottle and a half a day because Mom doesn't have her full milk back in yet. But she's definitely getting some because she's not drinking as vigorously as what she was. So we're still doing some bottle feeding. But because it's raining today, we're not going to go out and visit the sideshow because it's kind of becoming a bit of a muddy mess right now. So otherwise, I think that's about it for this week. I got stuff in the dye pots right now still that I'm working on. So if you can think of any colorways that you think would really look beautiful, let me know, because I'm still got plenty more to dye and get prepared for. Big 3-day festivals like this, I never feel fully prepared no matter what I do, which kind of sucks. You always feel like if you had that one more thing, you know, that would make the difference. So we'll see what I get done. I've got, let's see, about a week and a half to continue to dye, and I'm cranking out 4 to 5 pounds of yarn a day with only 2 pots. So that's not too bad, but I wish I had more space and more pots, like every dyer does. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and don't forget to hit subscribe right down there so that way you can find out about all the updates and all the new things that we're posting about, and make sure that you tell all your friends about the Fiber Circus because it's definitely a fun and entertaining time here. So thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye.